Luke Carter wiped the sweat from his brow as he leaned over the rusted hood of a battered Ford pickup. The summer sun bore down on his small auto repair shop in the outskirts of Timber Falls, a sleepy town hidden deep in the Pacific Northwest. With one hand on a wrench and the other steadying the carburetor, he sighed. Life hadn't been easy since his wife passed away 3 years ago. Since then, it had just been him and his 5-year-old son Jesse. Luke worked long hours, often skipping meals so Jesse wouldn't have to, always trying to stretch what little he earned to cover daycare, groceries, and bills that never seemed to stop piling up. The bell above the garage door jingled as Jesse bounded in, his tiny hands clutching a peanut butter sandwich. "Daddy, I made it myself," he said proudly, crumbs decorating his shirt like confetti. Luke gave a tired but genuine smile. "That looks like a masterpiece, buddy." He set down the wrench and ruffled Jess's unruly brown hair. The boy's innocence was Luke's daily reminder of hope, a small, beating light in a world that had gone too dark, too fast. It was Sunday afternoon when Luke decided to take Jesse for a short hike in the woods behind their house. The mechanic needed a break, and Jesse loved looking for frogs in the creek. Timber Falls was bordered by dense forests that stretched for miles, a wild and quiet place where Luke found rare moments of peace. He packed a small backpack with bottled water, a flashlight, and a protein bar, then hoisted Jesse onto his shoulders as they headed into the shaded trailhead. The walk was quiet at first, birds chirping overhead, and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Jesse chattered about how he wanted to be a fireman and how he'd rescue people stuck in trees. Luke smiled at the irony. He used to dream of being a firefighter too, before life diverted his path. But about 20 minutes into the hike, something strange happened. Jesse stopped talking, his face suddenly serious as he pointed toward a thick copse of trees just off the path. "Daddy, did you hear that?" he whispered. Luke paused and strained his ears. At first, he heard nothing. Then, faint, barely perceptible, a whimper. He narrowed his eyes and took Jesse's hand, motioning for silence. The sound came again, a broken cry, like that of a wounded animal. But this wasn't an animal. Luke's gut twisted as he moved closer, pushing through the underbrush, branches scraping his arms as they made their way through the thicket. And then he saw them. 2 small girls, identical, no older than 6, were huddled at the base of a tree. Their wrists were shackled by chains that looped cruelly around the thick trunk, their clothes torn and smeared with dirt. Their cheeks were hollow, eyes glassy with exhaustion and fear. One girl whimpered again, the sound no louder than a dying breath. The other just stared, her lips parted but silent. Luke froze, stunned. For a moment, he could hardly believe what he was seeing. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. Who would do something like this? He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the girls. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm going to get you out of here." The girls flinched as he approached, shrinking back against the bark. Luke slowly reached out, trying to soothe them with his tone. "I won't hurt you. My name's Luke. This is my son Jesse. We're here to help." He fumbled for his multi-tool in his backpack and tried to wedge it into the rusty padlock, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in his chest. He couldn't leave them like this, not for a second. Jesse, sensing the tension, stood silently beside his father, clutching his hand. "Stay with them." "Okay, buddy," Luke said, standing up. "I'll be right back." He sprinted back through the forest trail as fast as his legs could carry him, branches tearing at his clothes. His heart pounded as he reached his house, threw open the door, and grabbed his bolt cutters from the garage wall. He called 911 as he ran back, breathless and wild. "There are 2 girls," he told the dispatcher. "They're chained to a tree in the woods behind my house. I don't know who they are or how long they've been there. They need help now." By the time he returned, the girls were still where he left them. Silent, unmoving, as if their spirits had already left their bodies. Luke dropped to his knees and worked quickly, his hands trembling as he cut the chains free. The sound of metal snapping echoed through the forest. As the last link fell away, one of the girls collapsed into his arms. "It's okay," he whispered again, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You're safe now." They were so light, malnourished. One had bruises on her arms. The other had dried blood on her feet. Jessie looked up at him with wide eyes, silently asking if everything would be all right. Luke couldn't answer. He didn't know. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, followed by 2 paramedics. Luke watched helplessly as the girls were gently lifted onto stretchers, their fragile frames swaddled in emergency blankets. One of the paramedics shook his head in disbelief. "They're dehydrated. Starving. God knows how long they've been out here." Sheriff Dana Whitmore, a grizzled woman with a permanent scowl and a heart buried under layers of duty, took Luke's statement. He recounted everything. Where he found them, how they looked, what he'd done. She scribbled notes, nodding occasionally. "Do you know who they are?" she asked. Luke shook his head. "No idea. Never seen them before." "Well, check missing person reports. Someone had to report them. But if not," she didn't finish her sentence. She didn't have to. The girls were taken to Timber Falls Memorial Hospital. Luke followed in his truck, Jessie in the back seat, unusually quiet. He couldn't get the image out of his mind. The chains, the bruises, the haunted look in their eyes. Who could do that to children? What kind of world had he brought his own son into? At the hospital, Luke sat in the waiting room for hours. No one told him to stay, but he couldn't leave. He needed to know they were okay. Eventually, a nurse came out and told him the girls were stable but deeply traumatized. They hadn't spoken a word. Social services would take over once they were medically cleared. "Did they say their names?" he asked. "No," the nurse said gently. "But they're sisters, twins, and they didn't cry when we treated their wounds. Just stared. Like they're not really here." Luke swallowed hard. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, after his wife died. He knew what broken looked like. And those girls, they were shattered. That night, after putting Jessie to bed, Luke sat on the porch and stared up at the stars. The silence of the forest no longer comforted him. It unsettled him. How long had those girls been suffering within earshot of his home? What if he hadn't taken that walk? What if Jessie hadn't heard that whimper? He felt helpless and guilty, like he hadn't done enough. But what else could he have done? The next morning, Luke drove back to the hospital. He brought a teddy bear Jessie offered to donate and a bag of clean clothes. The nurses let him visit for a few minutes, though the girls remained unresponsive. They stared at him, but something in their eyes shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or safety. One of them clutched the teddy bear with a grip so tight her knuckles turned white. Sheriff Whitmore met him in the hallway. "No matches in the missing persons database," she said grimly. "No one's come forward. It's like they don't exist." Luke's stomach dropped. "So what happens now?" "They'll go into protective custody," she said. "A foster placement. Probably out of county since our shelters are full." Luke's jaw tightened. They're not ready for that. They need someone they know. They need to stay here, with someone who cares. Whitmore raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You volunteering?" "I have a spare room," Luke said, surprising even himself. "I've raised a child on my own. I'm not perfect, but I'll do whatever it takes." She crossed her arms. "You've got a criminal record from a bar fight 5 years ago, 2 late rent notices, and an unstable income." "I also saved their lives." She studied him, eyes narrowing. Then, to his astonishment, she nodded. "I'll make some calls, but don't expect a fairy tale. There's a process." That evening, Luke stood in the spare room of his small house looking around. He hadn't used the space since his wife passed. It still smelled faintly of lavender and dust. He opened the windows, shook out the sheets, and placed the teddy bear on the pillow. Jessie helped, his small hands arranging storybooks on the shelf. "Will they stay here forever, Daddy?" he asked. Luke knelt down and hugged him. "I don't know, buddy. But for now, we're gonna make them feel safe, just like you are." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the whispered pain of secrets once hidden. But in that moment, Luke made a silent promise, not just to the girls, but to himself. No matter what it took, He would not let them be lost again. Luke Carter stood at the kitchen sink early Monday morning, staring blankly out the window as steam rose from his chipped coffee mug. The events of the past 24 hours had left a heavy imprint on his soul. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girls again, thin wrists bruised by rusted iron, wide haunted eyes staring through him like he was a ghost. But they weren't ghosts, they were real, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Luke felt responsible for them, as though fate had placed them in his path for a reason. In the background, Jess's tiny feet padded across the hardwood floor. The boy rubbed his eyes and climbed into the kitchen chair, yawning loudly before digging into a bowl of cereal. Luke watched him, his heart twisting. Jessie was safe, loved. Those two little girls, he still didn't know their names, had never known that kind of security. At 9 a.m., sharp, there was a knock on the door. Luke wiped his hands on a towel and opened it to find a tall woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes, a clipboard, and an air of practiced detachment. She introduced herself as Heather Monroe, a social worker from Child Protective Services. "I've been assigned to the case involving the twin girls you found," she said, stepping inside with a briskness that left no room for small talk. "I need to assess your home immediately. Sheriff Whitmore informed me you expressed interest in temporary foster care." Luke led her through the small two-bedroom house. It was tidy, modest, filled with second-hand furniture and the faint smell of motor oil and pancakes. Jesse's drawings decorated the fridge, and his toys were neatly stored in a plastic bin. The guest room had been freshly cleaned, with floral bed sheets and a warm yellow lamp that Luke hoped felt inviting. Heather took notes quietly, her pen scratching rapidly against the paper. She peeked into cabinets, inspected the smoke detectors, and even flushed the toilet. Luke assumed to check plumbing. "You understand the girls have undergone significant trauma," she said, pausing to look at him over her glasses. "Yes," Luke said, his voice firm. "That's why I want them here. I don't want them sent off to strangers in a strange place." She sighed. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate what you did. But foster care placement follows a legal process. We can't prioritize sentiment over safety. You're not a licensed foster parent, and your financial situation is strained." Luke bristled but bit his tongue. He wasn't a man who asked for pity. He just wanted a chance. "I'm not asking to adopt them today," he said. "I'm asking you to let them stay somewhere they recognize, somewhere they were saved." Heather regarded him for a long moment, then softened. "I'll file an emergency placement request. It may take 48 hours. In the meantime, the girls are in hospital custody." That night, Luke sat with Jessie, reading a bedtime story, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't forget the way one of the twins had clutched the teddy bear he'd brought. Something about their silence haunted him even more than their chains. He wasn't sure if they couldn't speak, or simply wouldn't. The next morning, Luke received a call. The emergency request had been granted, pending evaluation over the next few weeks. He was to pick up the girls at the hospital by 3 p.m. His stomach flipped with nerves, but beneath the anxiety, a flicker of something else stirred hope. When he arrived at Timber Falls Memorial, the nurse met him at the entrance with paperwork and a quiet smile. "They've been waiting for you," she said. Luke stepped into the pediatric room and found the twins sitting side by side on the hospital bed, dressed in clean clothes and staring at the floor. He crouched down so his eyes met theirs. "Hey there," he said softly. "Remember me?" One of the girls, the one who had held the bear, nodded slightly. The other remained still, her arms wrapped around her knees. Luke extended a hand. "You ready to come home?" The girl with the bear slid off the bed and approached him slowly. Her sister followed after a pause, never letting go of her twin's hand. Luke's chest tightened as he watched them. No child should ever have to be this afraid. Driving back, Luke glanced in the rearview mirror. The twins sat silently in the back seat, hands clasped between them, eyes scanning the world like they expected it to hurt them again. Jesse, sitting between them with the innocence of a child, offered one of his crayons. "You can draw if you want," he said. My daddy keeps all my pictures on the fridge." One of the girls took the crayon cautiously, and Jessie grinned. When they got home, Luke showed them the spare bedroom. "This is yours now," he said gently. "No more chains, no more trees, just books, toys, and a nightlight." The twins stood in the doorway for a long time before finally stepping inside. The one who had accepted the crayon ran her fingers along the edge of the pillow. The other just watched, eyes flicking nervously between the door and her sister. That night, Luke made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Jessie talked nonstop, doing his best to entertain their guests. The twins remained quiet, but when the one with the bear reached for a second sandwich, Luke allowed himself a small smile. It was a start. He tucked them into bed with a soft blanket and turned off the lamp. As he stood in the hallway outside, he heard a sound, barely a whisper. "Good night." It was the first word either of them had spoken. Luke's eyes stung as he leaned against the wall. He didn't know which one had said it, and it didn't matter. They were beginning to trust him. But not everyone in town was as understanding. The following day, Luke stopped by the general store for groceries. As he grabbed a bag of apples, he overheard whispers from two women near the bread aisle. "He took those girls in. I heard they were chained up like animals. Why would the sheriff let a broke mechanic raise two traumatized kids? Doesn't he have his own to worry about?" Luke turned away, jaw clenched. The same townspeople who waved at him yesterday now eyed him with thinly veiled suspicion. It didn't help that Timber Falls was a small, tightly knit place where everyone knew everyone's business, and judgment traveled faster than wildfire. Back home, he ignored the gossip. The twins needed consistency, safety, and warmth. Luke tried his best to provide all three. He cooked their favorite foods, when he could get them to eat. He read bedtime stories, even when they wouldn't respond. He set up a coloring station, which they eventually began to use. Jessie proved to be the bridge he couldn't have built on his own. With the ease only children possess, he invited them into his world, day by day. They followed his lead during story time, let him show them how to brush their teeth, even shared his bath toys when they reluctantly agreed to bathe. Still, the twins remained mostly silent. Luke began calling them by nicknames: Rosie for the more curious one who'd accepted the crayon, and Lily for the quieter, more watchful one who rarely left her sister's side. He figured it was better than calling them the girls, while waiting for them to speak their real names. Heather Monroe visited weekly for progress evaluations. She seemed genuinely surprised by how the girls were adjusting. "They're still nonverbal," she noted, "but their physical health has stabilized. And your son's presence seems to help." Luke nodded. "They're still afraid to sleep without the light on. But they've stopped flinching when I come near." "You're doing more than most trained families could manage," Heather admitted. "But it's not over. CPS is still trying to trace their history. If we find next of kin..." Luke's stomach dropped. The idea of someone from those girls' past claiming them filled him with dread. What if those people are the ones who hurt them? He asked. Heather didn't answer directly. "We'll cross that bridge if it comes." Later that week, Rosie had a nightmare. Luke awoke to the sound of screaming, raw and guttural. He ran into their room to find Rosie thrashing in her sleep, arms flailing, eyes squeezed shut. Lily sat frozen beside her, unable to comfort her sister, visibly terrified. Luke knelt beside the bed and gently held Rosie's shoulders. It's okay. You're safe. You're home." Her eyes snapped open and met his. For a second, she looked ready to bolt. But then, slowly, she leaned into his chest and sobbed. It was the first time she had cried. The next day, Luke found something new on the fridge, a drawing. 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and 2 holding hands. In shaky red crayon were the letters, Luke. Not quite his name, but close enough to make his chest ache. They were healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. The breakthrough came 2 days later. Jessie was teaching Rosie and Lily how to build Lego houses in the living room. Luke was finishing a carburetor rebuild at the kitchen table when Jessie ran in, breathless. "Daddy! They told me their names." Luke dropped his wrench. He walked into the room, heart pounding. Rosie looked up and pointed at herself. "Emily," she said in a whisper. Then Lily placed a hand on her chest. "Ellie." Luke knelt down. "Emily and Ellie. Those are beautiful names." Emily gave the tiniest smile. Ellie didn't smile, but her eyes softened. He didn't cry then. Not in front of them. But that night, after they were asleep, he sat alone on the porch and let the tears fall. In just a week, everything had changed. He had gone from a struggling single father to a lifeline for two broken souls. He didn't know what the future held. Whether the state would let him keep them. Whether their past would catch up with them. But he knew one thing. He would fight for them. With everything he had. The days began to stretch into weeks, and in the quiet rhythm of shared meals, bedtime stories, and backyard play, Luke Carter started to feel the shape of something he hadn't dared to imagine in years. A family. Though exhaustion clung to him like grease beneath his fingernails, the presence of Emily and Ellie in his home filled a hollow space that had once seemed carved out for good. Life wasn't easy. His finances were stretched to their limit. The town's judgment still buzzed in whispers around every corner. And the girl's trauma remained a constant, silent companion. But amidst all that, there was healing. And in that healing there was grace. The twins had begun to develop individual personalities, subtle yet undeniable. Emily, the slightly more expressive of the two, was curious and quietly adventurous, often sneaking into the garage to watch Luke work on engines. She never touched anything, but she watched closely, her eyes sharp with interest. Ellie, on the other hand, remained shadow quiet, clinging to her sister's presence like breath to lungs. She didn't speak unless spoken to directly, and even then, her words were limited to a soft yes or no. Luke knew trauma didn't follow a schedule. It unraveled slowly, in private moments, in the way Ellie flinched when a door closed too fast, or the way Emily froze during thunderstorms, eyes locked on the window, as if expecting someone to break through it. Luke, in turn, became a student of their silence. He learned to listen to what wasn't said. He noticed the way Emily's hands trembled slightly when she was unsure, or how Ellie would sometimes stare at her own reflection, as if trying to convince herself she existed. Luke began to read parenting books at night, jotting down notes about childhood PTSD, attachment disorders, and trauma-informed caregiving. It was overwhelming, but necessary. These girls weren't just children. They were survivors. Heather Monroe, the social worker, visited weekly for welfare checks. Each time she arrived, clipboard in hand, Luke braced himself for the possibility that she might take the girls away. But with each visit, her tone softened. She began asking more questions about the girls' progress and fewer about his income. "They trust you," she said during one visit. "You've done something most people in your situation wouldn't even attempt." Luke shrugged, his voice low. "I'm just trying to give them what they never had." Heather scribbled in her notebook and looked up. "You ever think about adopting them permanently?" The question hit Luke in the chest. He'd thought about it. Every single day, in fact, but always shoved the thought aside, afraid it was too much to hope for. "Would I even qualify? You'd have to jump through a lot of hoops," she admitted. "But you're already halfway there." It was the first time someone had given him permission to imagine a permanent future with the girls. That night, as he tucked Jessie into bed and turned off the hall light, he paused outside the twins' room. The door was cracked open slightly, and inside, he could hear them whispering. Emily telling Ellie about her Lego house, Ellie softly giggling in return. A sound so pure it nearly broke him. The next morning, Luke drove the kids into town for Emily and Ellie's first day at school. It was only a half-day introductory session with the school counselor and a few trusted teachers, but it still felt monumental. The twins wore second-hand dresses and held hands tightly as they entered Timber Falls Elementary. Jessie, who had already been going for a year, held their other hands, proudly announcing to anyone within earshot, "These are my sisters." Luke had spoken to the principal earlier in the week, explaining their situation in broad strokes. The school agreed to be patient, to offer therapy and time outs, and to ease the girls into the classroom environment at their own pace. It was a risk, but Luke knew they needed structure. And more importantly, they needed to know they weren't alone in the world. The day didn't go smoothly. Emily had a panic attack when a substitute teacher raised her voice during attendance. Ellie refused to leave Jesse's side, gripping his shirt so tightly he had to sit in class with her just to keep her calm. By lunchtime, the counselor called Luke. "They're trying," she said gently. "But this is going to take time." Luke understood. Healing wasn't linear. It moved in jagged lines, like a cracked windshield, spidering out in unexpected directions. Back at home, Luke set up a rewards board with stickers and encouragements for every small milestone the girls achieved. Brushing their teeth without prompting earned a gold star. Speaking in class, a double sticker. One night, Emily asked for seconds at dinner, a seemingly small moment, but to Luke it felt like a mountain moved. Ellie, who once wouldn't make eye contact, began whispering to Jesse during bedtime, her face hiding a shy smile behind her blanket. But just as the wounds began to scab over, the past clawed its way back. One evening, as the family sat eating spaghetti in the warm glow of the kitchen light, Luke received a call from Sheriff Whitmore. Her voice was tight. "Luke, I need you to come down to the station. We've found someone." His heart stopped. Someone related to the girls? Yes. A man claiming to be their uncle. Says he's been looking for them. Luke was silent for a long time. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He didn't tell the girls where he was going. Jesse was already asleep, and the twins were watching a cartoon quietly on the couch. Luke stared at them a moment longer. How safe they looked, how still, and then quietly slipped out the door. At the sheriff's station, a man sat hunched over in the interrogation room. Grazy hair, faded denim jacket, a twitch in his left eye. Sheriff Whitmore leaned toward Luke. "Name's Travis Denton. Says he's the brother of the girl's biological mother. No record, but he seems unstable." Luke entered the room cautiously. Travis looked up, eyes bloodshot. "You the guy who took Em in?" "I found them," Luke said carefully. "They were chained to a tree." "Do you know how that happened?" Travis laughed bitterly. "Ain't my fault. Their mama got in with some real bad people. After her third boyfriend. I told her to stay away, but she wouldn't listen. I was out of town working on a ranch. Came back and they were gone. I've been looking." "And the mother?" Travis shrugged. "Dead. Overdose. Last year." Luke's stomach churned. "Why didn't you report them missing?" "I didn't know they were missing. I thought she dumped them on someone. Wouldn't be the first time." Sheriff Whitmore pulled Luke aside. "He's the closest living relative. Legally, he might have a claim." "No," Luke said sharply. "He didn't even know they were gone. He wasn't looking for them. He says he wants custody," she added grimly. Back home that night, Luke couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, staring at the flickering light of the fireplace. Every part of him screamed that Travis Denton was unfit, unsafe, unstable. But the law didn't always align with instinct. If Travis pushed for custody, Luke could lose everything. The next week passed in a fog. Emily and Ellie returned from school with small victories. Emily answered a question in class. Ellie drew a picture of a house. But their progress now felt fragile, as though a storm loomed just out of view. Heather Monroe scheduled a formal hearing with family court to determine next steps. "If you want to fight this, Luke, you'll need legal representation. Guardianship cases aren't just about love. They're about proof, process, stability." "I'll get a lawyer," Luke said, even though he had no idea how he'd pay for one. He took on extra shifts at the garage, even offered to mow lawns on weekends. One of his customers, a retired judge who'd heard the story, offered to connect him with a family law attorney willing to work pro bono. When Emily heard about the court hearing, she panicked. Luke found her under the table in the dining room, knees hugged to her chest. "You're going to send us away, aren't you?" she whispered. Luke knelt beside her. "No, sweetheart. I'm going to fight for you. For both of you." She looked up, eyes filled with a fear far too old for her face. "Promise." "I promise." The day of the hearing arrived with cold rain and trembling hearts. Emily and Ellie sat beside Jess on the bench outside the courtroom, drawing quietly while Luke and his attorney spoke inside. Travis Denton sat across the room, eyes darting, his posture coiled like a spring. Luke stood before the judge and told his story. How he found the girls, how he cared for them, how they healed slowly in his home. He described their nightmares, their silence, and the first time he heard them laugh. Heather testified on his behalf. Sheriff Whitmore did too. Even the school counselor submitted a letter in support of Luke's guardianship. Travis had little to say in his defense and less to offer in stability. When pressed about his living situation, he admitted he didn't have a fixed address. At the end of it all, the judge reviewed the paperwork and looked over his glasses at Luke. You understand, Mr. Carter, that by taking guardianship of these girls, you are committing to more than a rescue. This is a lifelong responsibility. Luke nodded, eyes brimming. I understand. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable. I'll take the weekend to review everything, he said. You'll receive the decision Monday morning. The waiting nearly broke Luke. He distracted the kids with movie nights and scavenger hunts, but inside he was unraveling. Monday arrived like a held breath. At 2 a.m., the call came. Congratulations, Heather said through the receiver. The judge granted you full legal guardianship of Emily and Ellie. Luke sank to his knees on the kitchen floor. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to sob, not from fear, but from relief. That night, he made pancakes for dinner, and as the five of them sat crowded around the small kitchen table, Emily reached for Luke's hand. Can we call you Dad now? She asked. Luke looked at both girls, his heart aching with joy. Only if you want to, Ellie nodded. We do. He squeezed their hands tightly, tears threatening again. In the quiet of that night, Luke Carter finally allowed himself to believe something he hadn't dared since his wife died. This broken world still held miracles. He just had to fight hard enough to find them. Spring arrived quietly in Timber Falls, creeping in like a secret, softening the edges of winter's harshness, with warm breezes and the bloom of wildflowers. The snow that once lined the forest trail behind Luke Carter's home had melted into fertile soil, and the trees, once bare and brittle, now swayed with green leaves and birdsong. It had been 6 months since Emily and Ellie first came to live with him. 6 months since he found them chained and starving beneath that very forest canopy. In that time, everything in Luke's life had changed, not with grand gestures or sudden riches, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of healing. Luke sat on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee from the same chipped mug he'd had for years. In the distance, he could hear Jessie's laughter carried on the wind, mixed with the higher, pitched giggles of Emily and Ellie. They were somewhere in the backyard, building something, likely another one of their famous forts, made from old sheets and sticks. What had once been a house filled with grief and silence was now bursting with life. Luke could hardly believe it sometimes. His once quiet world, dimmed by the shadow of loss, had been reignited by the very children he never saw coming. The twins had blossomed in ways that astounded everyone. Heather Monroe, the teachers at Timber Falls Elementary, even the cynical townsfolk who once whispered behind Luke's back. Ellie had gone from hiding behind her sister's shoulder to raising her hand in class and answering questions in a soft, confident voice. Emily, always a bit more forward, had joined the school's reading club and announced that she wanted to become a veterinarian when she grew up. They still bore emotional scars. Nightmares came sometimes, and loud noises could still send them retreating inward. But the difference was unmistakable. They were no longer just survivors. They were children again. Legally, Luke had full guardianship. The court had sealed the case after Travis Denton failed to meet the follow-up requirements for custody. Luke didn't rejoice in the man's downfall. He simply felt relieved. Every day he woke up and saw those 2 girls asleep in their beds, their hands often intertwined under the covers. He was reminded of how close he came to losing them. He never wanted to feel that helpless again. Financially, things remained tight. Luke still worked long hours at the garage, and although his reputation in town had improved after the court ruling. Business wasn't exactly booming, but he made it work. He fixed cars by day, picked up Jessie and the girls from school in the afternoon, and worked on side jobs after they went to sleep. His exhaustion was bone deep most days, but every bedtime hug, every crayon drawing on the fridge, every whispered, "I love you, Dad," made it worth it. And yet, beneath the surface of this hard-earned peace, Luke felt something stirring. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was longing. Not for the life he had before, but for something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for since the loss of his wife. Connection. Not just with his children, but with another adult. Someone to share the late night silences with. Someone to remind him that he was more than a survivor too. He hadn't acted on it, not yet. His days were too full, and his past too heavy. But he couldn't ignore the way his heart lifted every time he ran into Grace Holloway, the town's part-time librarian and full-time sunshine dispenser. Grace had first met Emily and Ellie during story hour at the library and quickly become a favorite of all three kids. She had a warm laugh and a habit of wearing flower print skirts, and she always remembered what kind of books each child loved. Luke found himself lingering during pickups, just to talk to her. She never pried, never pushed, just listened with kind eyes and a quiet strength he hadn't realized he'd missed. One Friday afternoon, Grace handed him a note folded in half. "From the girls," she said, smiling mysteriously. Back home, Luke opened it to find a drawing of him and Grace, sitting on a bench under a tree, holding hands. Below the drawing were the unmistakable signatures of Jessie, Emily, and Ellie, along with the words, "You should ask her to dinner." Luke laughed so hard he cried. That weekend, after much nervous pacing and Jessie coaching him with lines like, "Just tell her you like her face," Luke finally invited Grace over for dinner. To his surprise and delight, she accepted without hesitation. She arrived that Saturday evening with a homemade peach pie and a bouquet of wildflowers. The kids swarmed her instantly, dragging her inside and showing off everything from their bunk beds to their latest Lego castle. Grace took it all in stride, her laughter filling the small house like music. Luke watched her from the kitchen, heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. Over dinner, they talked. About books, about the kids, about life. Grace never treated him like a charity case. She saw him, all of him, and in her eyes he wasn't just a mechanic or a widower or a man who'd taken in two broken girls. He was just Luke. And that meant more than he could say. After the kids were asleep, they sat on the porch beneath the stars, sharing silence and sipping tea. "I've never known anyone like you," Grace said softly. Luke looked at her, unsure how to respond. "I mean it," she continued. "What you've done for those girls, for Jessie, it's incredible. You gave them a home, a life." "I just did what needed to be done," he said, his voice thick. "No," she replied. "You did what only someone with a heart that big could do." He smiled, feeling something fragile and beautiful bloom inside his chest. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. "You're not alone anymore, Luke." He believed her. The months that followed were filled with a quiet joy. Grace became a regular presence in their lives, reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, and eventually, holding Luke's hand during school plays and parent-teacher meetings. The kids adored her. Luke adored her. And for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders began to feel lighter. One sunny afternoon in July, they held a small ceremony in the backyard. Just the five of them, Grace, and Sheriff Whitmore, who had become something of an honorary grandmother figure. Luke had decided it was time to take the next step. With the help of Heather Monroe and a court-appointed lawyer, he filed to officially adopt Emily and Ellie. The paperwork had gone through without contest. As the twins stood beneath a makeshift archway made of garden vines, Luke knelt in front of them and opened a small wooden box. Inside were two delicate silver bracelets, each engraved with their new full names, Emily Carter and Ellie Carter. "You don't have to wear them all the time," Luke said, voice trembling. "But if you want to, I'd be honored." The girls didn't speak. They didn't need to. They lunged into his arms and held on so tightly Luke thought his heart might burst. Jessie clapped wildly. Grace cried. Even Sheriff Whitmore wiped away a tear. That night, under a sky painted with stars, Luke sat with Grace on the porch as the kids slept inside, safe and warm. The wind rustled the trees, and somewhere nearby, an owl called softly. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Grace asked. Luke nodded. "Every day. If I hadn't gone for that walk, if Jesse hadn't heard them." "You gave them a new story," she whispered. "And they gave you one too." He took her hand. "They gave me everything." And it was true. In saving Emily and Ellie, Luke had unknowingly saved himself. From the loneliness that had been slowly swallowing him. From the grief that had threatened to define him. From a life that once felt like it would never begin again. Now, there was laughter in the walls. There were footsteps running down the hall. There were drawings on the fridge, mismatched socks in the laundry, and dreams being dreamt in 3 tiny beds. There was love in every corner of that house, built not by blood, but by choice, by heart. And in the center of it all stood a man who once thought he had lost everything, who now realized he had more than he ever dreamed possible. A struggling single dad, a boy named Jesse, 2 girls rescued from darkness, and a woman who reminded them all what it meant to live fully. This was not the story Luke Carter ever expected. But it was the miracle he would cherish for the rest of his life.